Do you suffer from obstructive sleep apnea? If you haven't heard, Eli Lilly Zepbound has been approved by the FDA for the treatment of moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea. Lilly ran a 3-phase clinical trial known as the Surmont OSA. There were two numbers that stood out to me in the second phase of the trial, 51.5%. That was the percentage of trial participants that saw the complete resolution of their sleep apnea, and 62.8%, the percentage of participants in the trial that saw a reduction in their sleep apnea events per hour. For those of you that don't know what obstructive sleep apnea is, there are muscles that support the soft tissues in your throat, such as the tongue and the soft palate. These muscles can sometimes relax, and when this happens, your airway collapses and you can stop breathing while you're asleep. In a severe case of sleep apnea, this can happen 30 or more times each hour. Obviously, this is not a good situation because you aren't getting enough sleep. You're constantly waking up through the night and you can experience daytime drowsiness. Having sleep apnea puts you at increased risk for things like heart attack, heart failure, stroke, and coronary artery disease. You are at greater risk of having sleep apnea if you suffer from the disease of obesity, if you have a neck circumference greater than 17 inches for men and 16 inches for women, suffer from hypertension or diabetes, and if you are a man, because men generally are at a greater risk of having sleep apnea than women are. Sleep apnea is generally treated with a CPAP machine. CPAP stands for continuous positive airway pressure, and it works by blowing air into your airway to prevent an obstruction of that airway. I think the first time that I heard about sleep apnea was when my dad fell asleep on his commute home from work and he flipped his car. Thankfully, he was able to walk away. And then I learned that sleep apnea contributed to the death of one of my childhood heroes. I played defensive end in college, and I just idolized the Minister of Defense, Reggie White. He was 43 when he died from cardiac arrhythmia brought on by his untreated sleep apnea. It was reported that Reggie was claustrophobic, so he had a hard time using the CPAP mask. And about that time, my wife had told me that I routinely stopped breathing when I was asleep. So after what happened with my dad, with him flipping the car, and after Reggie White's death, I went and got a sleep study, and I was diagnosed with moderate sleep apnea, and that was in 2005. And after gaining more weight through the years, and while going through my second bariatric process to get the gastric sleeve, I repeated that sleep study test in 2014. This time I was diagnosed with severe sleep apnea. And again, that occurs when you have 30 or more apnea events per hour. I believe that diagnosis adjusted my sleep pressure up from, I think it was 6 or 8 up to 14. So as I started my GLP-1 journey and the weight started coming off, I had to adjust the pressure down on my machine. What I was finding is that as I got smaller, I needed less pressure to keep my airway open. This really started around April or May. The higher pressure was starting to blow my mouth open because the pressure was just too strong. I would constantly wake up with the dry mouth, sore throat. There was more pressure than I needed to successfully keep my airway open. This led to me turning the pressure down manually on the machine by going into the settings. And I continued at a lower pressure for a few months. But the event of blowing my mouth open kept returning. In July, I did another sleep study to confirm that I no longer had sleep apnea. And let me tell you, that sleep study was a disaster. This one was an at-home study. My previous two were in a sleep study facility. At this time, I was already down 95 pounds, and their monitors gave me vastly different results from what my CPAP machine was giving me in terms of apnea events per hour. My machine was measuring less than 4 events per hour, which is what you want. Their monitors were giving me vastly different results from what my CPAP machine was giving me. Their monitors were recording something way higher than I think it was 3 or 4 times what my CPAP machine was measuring in terms of apnea events per hour. So they said I needed a new prescription for my pressure settings, and this prescription was higher than the one I had got back in 2014. I weighed 358 pounds in 2014, so my pressure was put up at 14 to manage my severe sleep apnea. Here I am at 220, and they gave me a prescription for a pressure of 15. So in light of my weight loss, it's something that didn't make sense to me. My neck had also shrunk in size and went from a 20-inch neck down to a 16.5-inch neck. So I was also below the threshold for risk for getting sleep apnea. So I humored them for a little bit, and I used the machine as prescribed at the pressure setting of 15. I did that for about 4 or 5 days, and it was an awful experience. My mouth was being blown open all night long. My apnea events went all the way up to 30 or more per hour, and that's even with the machine on to keep my airway open. I eventually manually adjusted the pressure down to the lowest setting of 4, and my apnea events were less than 3 per hour, and oftentimes they were less than 1 per hour. So I showed this data to the sleep clinic and told me it didn't make sense and told me to speak to my primary. So I continued to wear the mask for a few months at the low pressure setting, and the pressure kept blowing my mouth open. Wasn't as much as before, but it would still happen from time to time. So in December, after talking to my doctor, I stopped using the machine and my sleep quality drastically improved. I went from averaging probably about 6 hours a night of sleep to 7.5 hours. I no longer snore and I no longer stop breathing when I'm in my sleep. So the medication has worked in resolving my sleep apnea. My wife is no longer complaining, getting up in the middle of the night to go sleep in one of our guest rooms because the air of the machine was blowing or I'm snoring. Now, there's no word on what criteria will get you approved for Zepbound in the treatment of sleep apnea. I think some insurance companies will pair it with an obesity diagnosis through using something like a BMI, and that can vary from insurer to insurer. But the good news is Medicare Part D plans now provide coverage for the treatment of sleep apnea using Zepbound. This is huge because private insurers will follow suit eventually. So does Zepbound treat sleep apnea? I would say yes, because mine is fully resolved. So after 20 years of lugging that machine around everywhere I went, on a road trip, on a plane ride, having to use that machine night after night, having to get distilled water to put in the machine, I no longer have to use it. I can sleep anywhere, go on any trip, and not have to worry about sleep apnea. I don't have to worry about the outcomes that having sleep apnea can lead to. So I'm real ecstatic about that. 20 years of having to use a CPAP machine is now over. These drugs are amazing.